I had four romantic relationships in college, and even though they were all highly transformative, they all ended in breakup. They ended in breakup because I outsourced love to other people. And it's not just me. Most elite college freshmen mistake relative love, the emotions you feel or actions you take for a partner, with absolute love. And this has created three major problems. Firstly, it puts responsibility on our romantic relationships to be our primary caregivers. We expect our partner to be our therapist, our study procrastinator, and our spiritual anchor all at the same time. And of course, great partners should be able to do this to some degree, but it's always our responsibility to be the primary caregiver because it's our internal challenges that ground all of the external challenges that we face in the relationship. Secondly, it puts insane expectations on our partners to fulfill us absolutely. Because when we replace relative love with, when we replace absolute love with relative love, it's like filling a sifter with sand, right? And often this is what breaks relationships rather than bad communication, cheating, or other things. It's because these are surface level issues created by the deep issue of the unconscious disappointment that our partners are not able to fulfill us absolutely. Only when relative love is put in its place can we love our romantic relationships without need. And the last and third issue is that we cut ourselves off from absolute love. This is the real tragedy. Gen Z is a bowl of anxiety, of depression, and nihilism. Walking around Cornell myself, I see students that are lit more by their screens than by the sunlight. I see students with their headphones in, their heads bowed, and shoulders slumped. Many talk of clubs or the exams that they're studying for like they're taking out the trash. And without absolute love, this is what happens. Reality is disenchanted. It's dead. It's a separate physical world, as confused as we are about what we're doing in it and why. To truly love our romantic relationships, ourselves, and the world at large, we need absolute love. Love for spirit, the groundless ground that encapsulates all of reality into one and imagines everything in consciousness. A love not only for how it creates and unifies, but also how it separates and divides. A love of reality as us, not separate. It was only after my fourth breakup that I was able to ask a profound question. What if college was simply about growing our ability to love absolutely? Absolute love can help you grow your romantic relationships and family and friendships too without nearly the same levels of conflict and more intimacy. It can help deepen your joy for your classes and studies. It can help build your connection with your clubs and hobbies. And most importantly, absolute love will deepen your ability to love yourself as everything. This video is going to be deeply philosophical, but also deeply, deeply practical. We're going to start by exploring what absolute love is, the traps and misconceptions that often come with it, what stops us from realizing absolute love, and finally, the golden practical stuff. What practically can absolute love tell us about loving our romantic relationships more mindfully? Are you ready? Let's do it. We're going to start with what is absolute love. To do this, we're going to use analogy from a unified thing that Gen Z loves: Minecraft. Imagine that you had a Minecraft ore made out of stones and diamond blocks. A big ore made out of those things. Relative love is mistaking only the individual blocks of diamond ore inside of that bigger diamond ore as love. Absolute love is loving the entire block of diamond ore, including all blocks of stone, all blocks of diamond ore, and the emergent properties that come from the whole thing. Said another way, relative love is love rooted in relative perspective, in valuation, in prioritization, like emotion for a romantic partner, helping a friend with their schoolwork, or feeding yourself so you don't die. Right? It's very practical. Absolute love is all of that and more. It's a deep metaphysical acceptance of spirit as it is right now, non-separate from us. The insight that absolute love brings is that all self-other distinctions are imaginary. In the course of our everyday college life, we separate ourself from other in order to practically survive. Right now, you're probably separating your body, your mind, from the video that you're watching, from me talking to you on the video. Makes sense. It seems real. Why would it not be? How could it be any other way? And yet, the insight that absolute love gives is that that distinction is imaginary. It is internally generated rather than externally constrained. Just like any imagination that you have, it seems like it's only coming from inside and other people don't experience it, which is why we call it imagination. The insight absolute love gives is that all your self-other distinctions are imaginary, which doesn't mean they're not logically consistent, coherent, or practical. It's deeply practical to separate yourself from me speaking to you on this video. But that doesn't mean that you have to. You see, what enlightenment really is, and what realization of absolute love really is when you separate those self-other distinctions so much that ultimately you are all of consciousness. You are so deeply tied and connected to everything that everything is one. And there's 4 different places that this can happen in. 4 different pathways, you could say. We're going to talk more about this self-othering in the why is it so hard to realize absolute love, but right now we're still grappling with what absolute love actually is. So those 4 different places that you can deepen your love for absolute love in are creative spirit, unitive spirit, separative spirit, and destructive spirit. Creative spirit is falling in love with all of the ways that spirit creates forms inside of consciousness. Things like colors, textures, your partner's body, and the elements of Expedition 33 coming together into one holistic video game. By the way, if you haven't played that game, incredible. There's even a skin in there where you can put a baguette as the backpack of one of your characters. Anyways, very random aside. Another way you can fall in love with spirit is unitive spirit, which is love for all the ways that spirit unites forms inside of consciousness. An ant colony, a college campus, the elements of this video coming together into one holistic message. You can also fall in love with separative spirit, which is the way that spirit separates things inside of consciousness. So the self and other distinction we were talking about earlier, the parts of your college major broken down individually, the pages of a book making up a whole, like Ken Wilber's integral theory. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, there is destructive spirit. And the reason that I say this might be the most important is that all the other forms of love, creative, unitive, separative, in some ways they're easy to love because they're more positively connotated. But absolute love loves absolutely. There is no divide, ultimately, which isn't to say that you will be able to realize this insight immediately. Absolute love is not something that you can just snap your fingers and suddenly, boom, you feel it. It's an ideal you build towards, and perhaps shouldn't meet in the point of life that you're at, which is what we'll get to later. Destructive spirit is love for all the ways that spirit destroys things inside of consciousness. This love is brutal. In some ways, it is the opposite of love, but it's also not, because even that is a judgment separation you're making inside of consciousness, and absolute love loves absolutely. You could say that destructive love is hate, which is simply a cruder, less holistic form of love. All these examples, you'll see that they're actually still love, just in a different form. So bear with me here. It's going to sound difficult to take in, but some examples of destructive love would be rape, 9/11, a coyote killing a house cat, cancer, the animal farming industry. All of these are lower spheres of love, but still love. I'm not validating any of these relatively as true forms of love. Absolutely, though, they are. Think about every single example I gave. In a way, they are still love of some sort. Rape, unfortunately, is a very low form of love for the person doing the raping. They are getting some joy out of doing it, unfortunately, and also surviving themselves if they pass on their genetics. So it's a very low sphere of love in that sense. 9/11 is also an example of a very low sphere of love, because the terrorists that did this did it for religious reasons, thinking that they were spreading the word of Allah. Another example, cancer. Cancer is a lower sphere of love. It's killing your body as a whole, yes, but the cancer is loving itself by reproducing and repeating its own cells over and over and over again, which ultimately does lead to your death, but it's still a lower sphere of love. So destructive spirit is much harder to love, but ultimately the absolute ideal is loving all forms of spirit: creative, unitive, separative, and destructive. Now, when I said deeper, destructive love is a lower form of a lower sphere of love, what I meant by that is that the more and more and more that you realize absolute love, the higher your spheres of concern become, because that's what it would mean to love absolutely. So it starts out egocentric, which you just love your own ego. It then moves to tribe-centric, ethnocentric, nation, culture, whatever, world-centric, and finally, the most radical, cosmocentric, where your love spreads not just to humanity or the animals on the planet, but to the entire cosmos as a whole. That is the deepest, most absolute form of love. Now, another insight is that absolute love is not just gratitude for the good things that have happened to you, but also, and sometimes most especially, like with destructive spirit, the bad things as well. For me, I think of my friendship losses in especially my freshman year of Cornell and how much they taught me. It sucked in the moment. It was awful, but I learned so much about what I valued and what I wanted in a friend. Another example is the death of my grandfather from pancreatic cancer, which was the first real death that I ever had to face inside of my family. That taught me a lot about loss and navigating grief. And the final example is the failure of past businesses I've done. There's a lot of things that if you're watching this Conscious College video, you haven't seen. I've been doing this for 6 years, and some of it has not worked out, like self-learning quest. I got a few hundred people doing that, but overall, I would still count it as not successful. It was successful in what it taught me, but it didn't reach out into the stratosphere and other things like the art of linked reading. I've had some successes as well, like Obsidian University, but these have all taught me valuable things. The last insight that absolute love I want to leave on for what it is that it's not just a emotion or action, but a participatory relationship with reality. Love stops being just an emotion you feel or an action you do, but an identity that you hold. A very identity with life itself, with creative, with separative, with unitive, with destructive spirit. The very way that you make sense of reality is grounded in absolute love. That is the ultimate goal. And one of the most valuable ways to do that is through my Cosmic Journaling Kit, which is a gamified journaling system that will help you realize absolute love and also build your emotional intelligence, your self-understanding, and your purpose with over 1,000 journaling questions and 5+ templates. So if that sounds fun, you can get it for free in the description below. Now we're going to move on to the common traps and misconceptions of absolute love, because there's a lot when you start getting into talking about this topic that people can stumble upon. Now, most of these are united by one thing, which is they all make the absolute love inflation trap. What that is especially when you first get into absolute love and realize how powerful it is, you inflate it to such a degree that you get rid of relative love or diminish it. But the mistake there is that absolute love loves absolutely. So it includes and transcends relative love. It doesn't reject it. So all of the traps I'm about to mention are founded in that, most of them at least. One thing that people often say is, isn't there no reason that I can't do evil under absolute love? Now, absolute love would imply this, because evil is a label that you've placed on reality, and absolute love loves absolutely. But what you'll find is that when you ground deeper in absolute love, you dissolve more of the self-other distinctions. And later on, we'll talk about navigating your shadows. This is just not what happens. Like, you will trend towards doing more compassion, being more kind, being more empathetic. And the reason is that you not only do you not reject relative love, but also you realize that anyone that you're doing quote unquote evil towards is you. So would you do profound violence, assaulting, harassing, lying, belittling, and discriminating against yourself? Hopefully not. Another trap is that people mistake absolute love as loving everything equally. This makes no sense, because obviously you're not going to love a stranger more than a family member, or love death more than life, because if you love death more than life, then you wouldn't be alive. So absolute love is not, it's an ideal that you strive for, but as long as you're living, as long as you're eating and breathing and drinking water, you haven't genuinely, absolutely realized absolute love. That's impossible. Otherwise you'd be dead. So the insight is to relatively love mindfully, rooted in absolute love, realizing that everything is you. which doesn't mean you love everything equally. It just means that you have absolute love founding the way that you relatively love. Another trap is mistaking acceptance as doing nothing. Because people will say, well, if absolute love means loving everything, even nothing or something, what's the difference between doing nothing and something? Isn't that making a judgment? Yes, that's true. But again, to act on a relative love level, mindfully, you root in absolute love, but you can still act with absolute love rootedness. You just realize while you're doing everything that everything is exactly perfect as it is. Absolutely. Relatively, though, there's still a whole bunch of suffering and quote unquote evil in the world, which you can work towards navigating. So it's not actually a paradox. Well, it is a paradox, but it's not a one that should stumble you. Another trap is people mistake acceptance of what is as condoning future things. So, for example, some people would say, well, if we accept everything that's happened, then, and there's no difference between anything, what's the problem with letting those bad things happen again? Like, for example, the Holocaust happened. So what's stopping us from saying, well, why even work to not make another one happen? And again, this makes the absolute love inflation trap. Relatively, we should not work to have that happen again. But absolutely, there is no difference between the Holocaust not happening and it happening. Another trap is that absolute love leads you to sacrifice everything for others. And the reason is, well, if everyone's you, then why not help everyone? I made this mistake when I was a freshman because I was privileged with a much easier childhood than most people. I had 2 really great parents and a twin brother, whereas a lot of the other students that came in had lots of trauma. And I would think, well, I'm in such a good position. Why shouldn't I help everyone? And what ended up happening is I was spending so much time working on talking to friends about their relationship struggles, helping friends with their exam procrastination and whatnot, that I ended up having no time to focus on myself and my own issues. And while those issues were quote unquote relatively less bad than my friends, not working on them eventually made them build up until they became worse. So the realization of absolute love is that is actually a corrupt form of absolute love, because if you loved absolutely, you would also love yourself enough to realize that loving yourself in that moment will help you love everyone else better. Another trap is mistaking absolute love as permanent nonviolence. For example, the most extreme perspective I sometimes get is, well, if I embodied absolute love, why couldn't a thief break into my house and I can't fight back? Because if I kill the thief, I'm killing myself. And another example people will use is, well, look at all the violence and suffering happening out in like third world countries around the world, like Saddam Hussein taking over Iraq. Shouldn't that have not happened? Shouldn't that have not been needed? And the insight is that, again, just because absolute love would say that those is no difference between doing anything in that those situations, that doesn't mean on a relative love level there aren't things that should be done rooted in absolute love. For example, with the thief, not fighting back is not loving yourself, your finite self in this case, because the thief is going to steal all your stuff and potentially, hopefully not, but potentially attack you as well. With Saddam Hussein, this is just for hypothetical's case. I'm not saying this is true, but perhaps Saddam Hussein's taking over of Iraq during the period he did actually led to less suffering relatively, because all of these groups were fighting each other in religious conflict, and then he united them all. And sure, it was tyrannical, but it might have reduced the amount of suffering in that moment. And that lessening of suffering perhaps led Iraq to develop a little more and can then navigate a more difficult, more conscious political system like democracy or socialism or something else. And perhaps if someone had come in, assassinated Saddam Hussein, and then that would have sent the whole region into more turmoil. So that's the dilemma of absolute love, is sometimes it does mean doing violence, but rooted in absolute love. Another trap is mistaking absolute love as only positive feelings, right? For example, you love joy, you love happiness, you love excitement, but you don't love jealousy or anger or hatred. But that's not absolute love. Absolute love loves everything. So to truly love absolutely, you have to love even your shadow, even all of the evil in the world, all of the destructive spirit. So one example for me that hits so close to home is I recently saw my ex again, and I learned that they were very happy with another partner. And what I found so profound in that moment is that all I felt for them was joy. Sure, there was some sadness as well, but I was so absolutely loving of the fact that they were happy with someone else in a way that they couldn't be with me at the time. It was incredible. And if I had not been as conscious, I could have easily gotten into a relative love trap of like, oh, well, if you're not happy with me, then what is the point? Like, you shouldn't be happy with anyone. Another trap is mistaking absolute love as only feminine rather than masculine. This is stereotypical forms of love. I'm not saying you can't, as a feminine, do masculine love, or as a man do feminine love, but in general, feminine love is more stereotypically caring, kind, not treading on someone's boundaries or comfort zone. And masculine love is more hard and ruthless and straight to the point. Both are necessary for absolute love. For example, with my twin brother, there's a lot of masculine love. We have this relationship where we just tell each other the hard truths, which I love. And with another friend, we have much more of a feminine understanding of love, because I've experimented before telling them the hard truths. It doesn't work. They lash out. So I've had to get better at figuring out what season of life are they in, and are they capable of hearing that thing that I want to tell them. So another trap is mistaking love as being a doormat. Right? So I remember this one story. This really was fascinating for me. So I was with a friend trying to get an Uber to go back home. And as I was looking at the phone to see where the Uber driver was going, I noticed they were going in the wrong direction to get to us, in a way that I knew they thought they were going in the right direction, but they were just going in the wrong one because they hadn't been in the area before. So I was like, okay, let's call them and tell them they're going the wrong direction. And my friend was like, no, you can't call them. We don't want to disturb them. And I just remember being like, what? Like this is their job. Like, their job is to drive to where you are, pick you up, and then bring you somewhere else. What do you mean don't call them? And I don't blame them for saying this in the moment. I understood completely why they're doing it. It's because on a relative love level, they were too grounded in not treading on people's boundaries. Now, in this case, there wasn't really a boundary there, right? The Uber driver was totally fine when I called them, but an illusion of a boundary, which absolute love would help you see the illusion of. And the final trap of absolute love is mistaking the state of feeling absolute love as grounding in absolute love. The state of absolute love is a momentary experience of absolute love. You might have it while in nature, on a psychedelic, in a very intimate encounter with a romantic relationship. But ultimately, after this state is over, you go back to your everyday normal reality. There's a difference between states and structures. This is some great work done by Ken Wilber, as well as Claire Graves, Christopher Cohen, and Don Beck. Hopefully I said those names right in spiral dynamics. States are temporary, momentary experiences, whereas structures are manners of interpreting reality. In absolute love's case, you can have a state in absolute love, but if you don't have a grounding structure, a way of interpreting reality in a way that helps you integrate that state experience, you're going to diminish the true power of absolute love. So an example would be a stage green, and be mindful of my terminology here. This is all spiral dynamics, integral theory language. Stage green college student having an absolute love experience, going back to everyday reality, and then integrating that only for liberals in the LGBT community and the university environments, but not for the entire world and all conservatives as well, because there's a big culture war between them. That is a falsifying of absolute love. It's a relativization of it, because ultimately you're not loving everything absolutely. You're just loving the worldviews which you like more. So that's a pretty exhaustive list of most of the traps that you'll come across with absolute love. The next question is, what are the things that keep us from loving more deeply? And here's where I want to give you 2 questions to contemplate on before we go any further, because I want you to really question everything I'm saying and realize it for yourself. The first question is, where do you secretly still believe love should have limits? The second question is, who would you stop loving if it cost you your identity? I'm going to give you a few seconds to meditate on those. Okay, so those are 2 questions that you can contemplate. Now, there's a really powerful meditation that can help you realize what is keeping you from absolute love. I encourage you to do this as well, even after this video, because it will help you ground more and more inside of absolute love and what's keeping you from it. If you're driving, please don't do this. If you're doing anything which would put you in danger while doing some sort of imagination, you could still be walking. I don't think you have to have your eyes closed, but it will help if you do. I want you to imagine something you love. It could be a romantic partner, a food, a video game. Really feel into the love that you have for that thing. Whatever emotions come up, thoughts and other things. Now, I want you to try and expand that love out to everything that you can think of. Expand it out to your family, to your friends, to your college itself. Expand it out also to destructive spirit, to war, to rape, to cheating, anything that you can think of. And what I want you to see is, where does resistance come up? That resistance is your key to the things that are keeping you from still loving absolutely. Again, I'm not saying that this is something that you should dissolve instantly. There's a lot of work that needs to be done before you can really reach a close to absolute form of love. And perhaps not all of those things should be dissolved right now. But this meditation is a super valuable way of seeing where those blockers still are. So now that you've asked those questions and you've done that meditation, meditation's over. Let's get into the root, the meat. What keeps us from absolute love? What keeps us from absolute love is simply selfishness. It is simply selfishness. What I mean by selfishness is exactly that. Self-othering and then prioritizing yourself more than others. So going back to what we were saying earlier, you self-other you and your relationships, you and your bedroom, you and your classes, and especially you and destructive spirit, cheating, raping, school shooting, war, and on and on and on and on. Then, once you've created this self-other, you survive those distinctions. You do self-survival because humans don't just survive on a physical sense. We survive on a psychological one. We survive our ideas. We survive our identities. We survive our beliefs, our relationships. Some examples would be surviving your achievement relationship by continually doing work around friends or your romantic relationship. Surviving your procrastination identity by watching shorts or films a few hours or days before big assignments due. Surviving comparison by continually comparing yourself to other students. Then we have collective self-survival, like surviving your frat or sorority partying identity by partying. Surviving your liberal college identity by arguing liberal beliefs with friends. Or surviving your grade culture by participating in the grade culture. So we survive those distinctions. We survive on an individual and a collective level. What makes it so hard to dissolve these self-other distinctions? Because those are the things keeping us from absolute love. Well, one of the main ones is our shadow, which is the parts of ourself that we attach to through addiction or allergy. Addiction is when we're so close to a part of ourself that we can't appreciate how it's affecting us. For example, addiction to exercise because it helps us block up how uncertain we are in our life purpose. Addiction to short form content because it helps us realize how little connection we truly have with our friends. And that's why we use it so often when we're around them. Allergy is when we're so avoidant of a part of ourself that we can't appreciate how much it's affecting us. An allergy, you could have an allergy to spirituality and religion because we're so heavily indoctrinated in science. You could have an allergy to self-improvement because we're so heavily biased against capitalism. An analogy you can think of this as is that our shadows are like tectonic plates dividing two landmasses. Dividing two landmasses. And our shadows keep us from bridging the self-other divide of those landmasses because we're far too attached. This is what keeps us from absolute love. Now, I don't want to make the shadow seem totally bad. That would also be a trap of absolute love. The shadow is trying to help us. It's trying to protect us in its own way. And sometimes it really does help protect us. But sometimes it also leads us to not be able to realize as much love as we can. So going back to the examples, for like doing short form content in front of your friends is helping you keep that connection with them. It's not realizing how shallow the relationship truly is. And perhaps in the moment, that's very good because if you didn't have those friends, you would be so lonely and it might lead to tremendous amounts of suffering. So our shadow is trying to help us in some way. Now, the question then becomes, what are some other common shadows? There's a lot of shadows that you could have. Like, for example, fear. For me, this shows up as a fear of doing more workshops for Conscious College. because I have recently realized the obvious conclusion. Well, why don't I do guest lectures on this content inside of college itself? I think it would help a lot of people. And yet, as I've thought about that, there is a bit of a fear that comes up, a shadow, because I haven't really tested this content in front of large audiences. And I'm aware of how radical it is. So my fear is I'll share something like exactly what I'm talking about in this video. And because it's not totally, quote unquote, scientific all throughout, at least in terms of what most colleges still consider science, I fear some negative reactions might come. And that's something I have to work out because I think not all of that is fully true. I think a lot of people would find it very insightful if I shared this in person. Another common shadow is not loving yourself. For example, a friend who doesn't love themselves, so they seek love in other people, perhaps when those other people also can't give them the love that they seek because they too are hurting on the inside. Another common shadow is lack of self-esteem. This is a huge one. Lack of self-efficacy, the competence and confidence that you can do something, and a lack of self-worth. So I have one friend, for example, who isn't confident in themselves, even after being much more competent than what I consider most Cornell students as. And Cornell students are quite competent. So this just goes to show that the external truth of the matter often is not what someone's reality is. It's their relationship to that truth internally that roots it. Some other common shadows are being able to say no, a practicality bias, perfectionism, procrastination, comparison, imposter syndrome, things like that. There's some other things that keep us from absolute love too. One of the main ones, this is huge, is unburnt karma. So karma, I don't mean in the sense of like, oh, you birth and rebirth like in Hinduism or Buddhism. I mean stuff that you know you need to do in order to really fully adopt this insight. Because if you didn't do it, even though you can say logically, I don't need this in order to ground in absolute love, something in you just says, no, you have to do that. Otherwise, I won't let you absolutely love. So, for example, I know that I need a spiritual business and a romantic relationship before I can feel truly satisfied with what I've done and fully realize absolute love. This is something I've tried navigating in meditations and contemplations. Like, what would it feel like if I didn't do these two things? And, it wouldn't be the end of the world, of course, but there's just a resistance that continually comes up. And I think it's easier to burn through that karma than to try and bypass that. For you, burning through that karma might be having more sex, making more money, getting some more better grades, or whatever, getting into that one graduate school you want. Another aspect that keeps us from absolute love that we talked a little bit about earlier is low grounding structure. Structure, again, is the way that you interpret reality. There's a whole bunch of different structures talked about in integral theory, going up from infrared all the way to clear light. But most college students are in orange or green. And this structure level is still before the structure level called tiers 2, where you're aware of all the structure levels and integrate and transcend and include them inside of you. Integrate and transcend. Which is what you need for absolute love. So if you aren't in those structure levels, you'll inevitably take a state and then interpret them in a way relatively that doesn't help you realize absolute love. Which is also another thing that doesn't help you realize absolute love is low grounding state. Your state might be gross or subtle, which just means that in the gross case, you still see reality as fundamentally material, physical, body, atoms, and nothing else. And subtle gets a little more deep than that, but ultimately that blocks you from realizing absolute love because there's all these other aspects to reality, if you go more in the spiritual path, that you aren't integrating and transcending and integrating and transcending into you. So two other things that block us from absolute love is loving only in a smaller sphere. Like there's 4 different quadrants There's 4 different quadrants talked about in integral theory of which you can experience reality. There's the interior individual, like your mind, your emotions, your feelings. There's the exterior individual, like atoms, your body, immediate surroundings. The interior collective, like the shared feeling between two people as they're talking, culture. And then there's the exterior collective, like social systems, societal structures, buildings, entire cities and countries and stuff like that. And a mistake of absolute love is only to love in one of those quadrants. So maybe you get really good at loving your emotions and your thoughts and your body, the individual, but you're like super introverted and you don't go into the collective. Well, that's not loving absolutely because you're only loving a partial aspect of reality. And the last and most important, or not most important, but last and most radical, you could say, reason that people do not love absolutely is that it's just too good to accept. It's actually insane how good it is. It's too good to be true. I mean, imagine, how would it feel if you genuinely felt like everything was perfect? Absolutely nothing needed to be different. Truly ideal, absolute love realization. It is way too good to be true. And in fact, most of us, including me to some degree, don't want to realize that because in a way, we don't want to be happy. We don't want to be absolutely loving because all the shadows, all the self-other distinctions that we've created throughout our lives are helping us with not realizing that. And they're practically making our life better in our selfish way, right? Maybe the selfish distinctions that we're making are helping us keep closer to our friends. Maybe our entire motivation system has constantly been using downward motivation by using negative emotions like hatred and anger and resentment to motivate us our entire lives. And if we realized, well, maybe absolutely loving is loving everything instead of using these negative emotions to self-other a whole bunch of society, then we wouldn't be as motivated anymore. And that would suck for a bit. So that is the last and most radical reason that we don't love absolutely. We don't want to. And that's why it's so important that you don't necessarily say, okay, absolute love means I need to realize this now, instantly. No, that this is a process that we work towards and an ideal that we go for. And now with all of that set up, we can finally get to the most practical section of this entire video, which is how can we love more mindfully in our romantic relationships with absolute love in mind. And after a short break, that's what we're going to dive into. All right, the really practical stuff, how to love in your relationships with absolute love in mind. Can you tell that the caffeine's kicking in? I can definitely tell. So let's go through the top 5 insights, and then we'll move on to some really more powerful ones, but not as primordial as the top 5. So insight number 1 is absolute love means entering a metaphysical relationship with your partner. An analogy you can use to understand this is imagine that you and your partner are painters with your own canvas and your own colors for painting. My paint colors would be green and blue. Partners might be purple and orange. When you enter into a metaphysical relationship with your partner, you're exchanging not only your colors, but also creating a shared painting. And this is beautiful for a number of reasons. One is that not only are you collaborating on creating something together, but you are literally seeing reality differently. You're relating to it, identifying it with it in a different way because you have different colors from your partner. They have different colors from you. The mixture of both of them makes something different. And this makes you identify entirely differently with reality, which in turn changes how you paint and then makes you identify differently. Think about how much more beautiful of a way of thinking about love that is than just an emotion or an action that you do for your partner. Insight number 2 is become your own primary caregiver. This one is particularly close to my heart because when I first started dating in college, I hadn't done any dating in high school. It felt almost like a need for me. I had this hole inside of my heart that I needed my partner to fill. I unconsciously expected my partner to be able to get this gap that I'd been feeling inside of my life. And this led to some suffering in my initial partnerships because I wasn't conscious enough to do some things that would have led the relationship to be better. The thing that helped me was reading this one book called You Are the One You've Been Waiting For. And the insight that this book gives is that you are the one you've been waiting for. You are seeking in a partnership someone that will fulfill you, but ultimately only you can do that. Sure, your partner can help do this as well, but it needs to be rooted in self-love without the partner. And once I realized this, my entire analogy for how I thought of relationships changed. Instead of filling a hole, it was building a tower. Think about how differently that makes you relate to partnerships. They're not not filling a gap that you have. They're rather just accentuating the beauty that's already there. And this also ensures that you don't let your partner clip your wings. Because when you feel like your partner is filling a hole for you, you're much more needy, and I at least changed too much for my partners, which ultimately led me to feel like I wasn't really being myself in the partnership anymore. The third insight is accept your partner as they are, not as you want them to be. I, in especially my later partnerships, unconsciously tried to get my partners to push into spirituality and self-improvement without realizing that that might not be the season of life that they were in. I unconsciously was validating my own journey into spirituality and self-improvement because so many people around me weren't doing it. And to me, it seems so obvious. Like, why would these people not want to get into spirituality and self-improvement? It's like the point of life. But that was for me at the time what I needed. And what I didn't see is that perhaps for their season of life, they shouldn't be doing that. And also, perhaps I was projecting what they should be doing at some point onto them, and maybe they would never. You see, when you accept someone as they are, two things happen. One is you stop manipulating them through disappointment. And the other is that the growth that does occur is real and not coerced. And paradoxically, when I started accepting my friendships, my partnerships, my family for who they were rather than who I wanted them to be, they actually started changing more into who I wanted them to be before. Very trippy and paradoxical in that way. Insight 4 is understand and love how you and your partner have acted from selfishness. One of the most powerful things I ever did in my life for spiritual growth was this insight. And it all started from doing a forgiveness meditation after this particularly awful moment in my life, which was I was experimenting with polyamory, which I'd never done before. And one day I sat down with my partner at the time, and I basically explained to her all the struggles that I was going through in the relationship. Like, I'm experimenting with this polyamory. I feel like I'm not getting as much needs fulfilled as I would like in this partnership, because I only had one partner, they had two. And I really need some more effort on your part in order to fulfill some of the needs that I know are just who I am, like deep listening, asking questions, spending quality time. I was really struggling, like crying a little, and I felt very heard while I was saying this. But at the end of this whole ordeal, where she was like, "Yes, I'll work on those things. Thank you for telling me." She said, I'll never forget this. "How do you feel about me dating this other person?" And I was devastated. I was so, at first, angry because what do you mean? How could you possibly ask me something like this after I just told you every way that I was suffering in the relationship? For a while, this sparked some resentment in me. It was one of the only times that I've ever raised my voice. Actually, the only time I think I've ever raised my voice with her. Usually I'm very calm and grounded. And one of the most powerful things that I did from this experience was I did a forgiveness meditation. I put myself back in that situation, and I really felt how I was feeling. Then I asked myself, from her perspective, how might she have been acting from the cardinal things that all humans act with at some point in their lives? Ignorance, a lack of love for themselves, selfishness, lack of consciousness. There's one more, but I'm forgetting it right now. And then here's where you flip it around. How have I been acting from those things as well? And this was profound for me, because not only did it help me realize what in them led them to do that, because if I was in their position and all the experience that they had exactly the same, I would have done the same thing. But it also helps me realize how I was also doing things that were in the same relationship towards life as what they were doing. Now, to this day, I don't think they were as extreme, but it helped me forgive not only myself, but them in that situation. And this is something that in all relationships can be powerful. If you ever feel yourself being cut off from absolute love because relatively you're struggling to see why this person did this thing to you, forgiveness meditation, understanding how they acted in this way, is so powerful. And it doesn't mean relatively you still don't see the negative aspects of that, but it's rooted in an absolute love and understanding. So before I share insight 5, because insight 5 is the most powerful, what are some other profound ways to relatively love rooted in absolute love? Well, one is respecting the sovereignty of the other person. A good example of this is in one of my partnerships, the person was not that had a bad relationship with expectations. And in one of the ways that I loved them during that partnership was I experimented with being less expectation prone. Like in small things, really subtle things that if you weren't thinking about absolute love in this way, you just wouldn't think of. But like that's what in some ways love is subtly loving your partner. And an example of that is I would spend less time setting up explicit hangout sessions with them, which is something I usually do with all my friendships. I'm very usually scheduled. I'm also a spontaneous sort of guy, but usually when I hang out with someone, it's more scheduled. And with her, I would be more open to just having them come over just randomly, which is something I was not used to. And honestly, to this day, I still like the scheduled stuff more, but loving them meant respecting their sovereignty in that way. Another way to absolutely love more is be physically proximate to the other person. Good example of this, one of my best friend John. I'd known him online for 2 years, and we had a fantastic relationship. But we finally saw each other in Vancouver during a summer 2 years ago, and that like super upgraded the relationship. We had a powerful relationship online already, but there's something about being physically proximate to someone that just changes things. Even just once. Right now, since then we've seen each other again for 2 weeks, physically proximate. But man, that's powerful. Another is honoring the uniqueness of the other. Understanding their life purpose, their quests, their values, their motivations, their attributes, their skills, alongside their shadows. Another is being kind yet stern when necessary, a balance of both masculine and feminine love. I have more masculine love with my brother, with my friend John, with Fionn, and more feminine love with two of my other friends, knowing how to balance between the two. Another is taking their wins and goals as your own. I do this a lot with my twin brother. We're like in a team in life, the team of becoming financially free. He did this in one of many ways. He created my Conscious College logo. So if you see the brain with the stars and the graduation cap, that looks incredible. That was him. And I have in one of many ways, I helped him give feedback on his business idea to make a title generator for $10,000 a month plus revenue YouTubers. I gave him UI and UX feedback, as well as some visual design and gamification engagement design feedback. So that's another thing, taking their wins and goals as your own. Letting them influence you. This is huge. One of my friends, I let influence me to get more into Spanish debate, into engineering and STEM. And these are things, if I was not friends with them, there's no way I would have done those. I mean, Spanish debate. I speak fluent Spanish now, especially in reading and writing. A little bit less so in speaking and listening. But man, let me tell you, doing Spanish debate when you haven't fully learned Spanish will instantly teach you Spanish. Oh my God. The fear of standing up in front of a crowd and having to argue something in a language that I didn't know. That's crazy. So I did it for them. Another is assuming good intentions until they're broken. A friend might do something and you might question it at first, but if you truly love them, unless it's too extreme, then you will assume they did it acting from good intentions. Because this is another insight of absolute love. Most people act from good intentions. They think what they're doing is good. It's just often a relatively smaller form, lower sphere of concern than absolute love. But they still think they're acting from good. Another is being there even when the other is at their worst. Kind of funny example of this was there was one point where one of my friends like really hurt their foot in college and they were on a cane for 3 weeks. And I was driving them everywhere, every single day. They would call me in like the middle of the day. Keep in mind, I was still working a full time for the Octalysis group. And I would just, I just go out and I just drive them to places. To classes, back to the apartment. So that was me being there for them at their worst. Thankfully, their foot got better. Don't know what I would have done if that was just perpetually they're on their cane now, at 21. Another example, one of my exes got horribly drunk one day while we were doing slope day at Cornell. And I walked them all the way back to their apartment, so that they could, rest and not slide around. They were so drunk they were sliding around on the grass, which obviously we had to talk about afterward because there were some shadow drinking problems in their past. They hadn't drank for a year, and then they drank a whole bunch, and that was a conversation that we talked about. But I was there for them at their worst, and people have done that for me too. I've had some bad moments. We all have. Another thing is keeping your promises with them. I've noticed me and my twin brother connect a lot over this actually. there's something about breaking integrity, which is actually a habit. I've noticed I used to be when I told you've done this as well. I've done like you're talking to a friend or an acquaintance you haven't seen in a while, and they're like, "Yeah, we should grab lunch," and then you say, "Yeah, we'll do it like sometime this next week or on this day," and then you never do. And sure, that's a small thing like that can seem harmless, but that's actually a habit. It's a breaking of integrity that builds over time. And then next thing you know, when you're at an internship or you're working for some company and you say, yeah, I'll do this by this date, and you're already in the habit of breaking integrity, it feels more okay to just not do it. And sometimes I think that's good. Sometimes a white lie is better than telling the truth. But also, I have gotten in the habit of trying to be brutally honest most of the time. And this has done wonders for my love, actually, because people know what I tell them, for the most part, is true. And if I tell them I'm going to see them on this day, I will see them on that day, unless something extreme happens. Or if I tell someone I'm going to do this for work at this time, then I'll do it. So that's been really powerful. Another thing is caring about the suffering of the person without necessarily trying to solve it immediately. A good example of this, I have a friend who they had a particularly difficult romantic relationship when they were younger, and I had noticed that every single time after that, they had become addicted to that romantic relationship because they sought characteristics in every partner I'd seen them go for that were the same in the first relationship. And I saw them do it again this one time, and I didn't tell them immediately because they were so into it. They were so excited because I hadn't been in a relationship for so long that I knew if I told them straight up, hey, there's like a bajillion red flags that I'm seeing here, danger, they would have lashed out really hard. I put the seed in their mind by asking them some tailored questions that helped them see how that might be the case. But I let them suffer a little, which sounds bad. Like, oh, Aiden, how could you let them suffer a little? No, I actually think this helped longer term with their life, because if I had been too upfront, they would have reacted negatively, very negatively. And the relationship didn't work out. And eventually they came to me and they're like, why didn't that work out? And then I was honest with them. And they're like, oh, you're right. And now I think they're more mindful in every other occasion with the relationships they try and get into. Sometimes it works the opposite way. Sometimes you need to make them suffer in the short term for a longer term benefit. And that is true love. And if you weren't willing to do that, then you didn't really love the person because you love them more for when it helps you. Another example is trying to navigate conflict with them mindfully, right? Not doing stonewalling or contempt or blaming, really trying to see where they're coming from instead of projecting your own belief about the conflict onto them. Another example is seeing past romantic infatuation. Romantic infatuation is the addiction to a partner for all of the good parts of them, but blind to all of the red flags because of how addicted to the partnership you are. So I even knew about romantic infatuation, and it still happened to me, especially in my second partnership in college. I couldn't see past all of the red flags that were there because I hadn't been in a relationship for a bit. And this was after the culmination of a whole bunch of online dating, which was awful. So I was like very excited about being in a partnership. And I wasn't able to see all of the red flags that were really there until afterward, in which they were so obvious. Another thing is sometimes love is just giving the paint, but not taking anything in return. So in a less romantic example, when I saw my Dutch cousins a few weeks ago, and they're 14 and 16. So one of the things I found interesting is that I felt this particular form of love a lot giving but not really receiving as much in return. Like I talked a lot about stuff that they asked me. I asked them about their life. We played games together. And it was so beautiful in the sense that I didn't need anything in return for them. I didn't need like more wisdom from them or anything like that. It was just purely appreciating the relationship for the relationship in the moment, giving them paint but not receiving as much in return. Another example is helping each other not feel lonely. This has been interesting for me because I don't value understanding as much as some of my other friends do. I used to value it a lot, but I've realized at this point in my life, like, well, first off, I am everyone and you are me. That's one of the insights you have from absolute love. So, who is there to understand except you? And it's not that I don't value some degree of a friend being able to guess what I'm feeling or why I'm feeling it, but at this point, it's just so astronomically difficult for that to be done fully because of how many random things that I've gone into. I'm not saying I'm like, I'm the most unique person ever. You'll never be able to guess what I'm feeling. No. That would come from like egoic pride of being so interesting it's impossible to guess. I mean, just like you get to a certain point where you ventured into so many things and there's so many shadows you've navigated that you couldn't reasonably expect someone to actually understand it all. But I've learned to value it more in other friendships because they value understanding so much. So one thing I've started doing recently, which I wasn't used to at all, is when a friend is feeling something, if they value this a lot, I try and make a statement about how they're feeling and why. And before, and this would be so alien, I'd be like, why am I doing this? But they appreciate it so much if I'm correct. And they don't judge they don't judge me if I'm wrong. But this has made them feel much more connected inside of the relationship. Another example is loving them enough to let them go when it will help both of you in the long run. This was particularly hard to accept with some of my high school friends and my earlier friends in college. Our values began to differentiate so much and our path began to differentiate so much that staying in the relationship was actually hurting us because I just didn't feel authentic in the interaction. And that inauthenticity was starting to come through. So paradoxically, letting them go actually was loving them more. Another example is giving time, attention, and awareness. I felt this particularly. I had a friend a few months ago who got broken up with because they were too philosophical. That's what their partner said. They were too philosophical and negatively coded in their way they talked about life, which I thought was a little funny. But because that might happen to me too. But I was there for them. I gave them a lot of time, attention, and awareness. And that was a form of giving love in that moment. Another example is helping them surpass you. Because if they surpass you, that's you surpassing yourself. So it's really not a negative. This particularly I feel with my twin brother. I have partly been the person that has helped him surpass me in video editing and coding. Now, obviously, most of it was him. I'm not claiming like I claim all credit for him doing it, but with few recommendations or questions or feedback here and there, and he's gotten so much better at both of these avenues in ways that I will never get to because we're just on different paths. Another example is following upaya while interacting with them. Upaya is a Buddhist concept known as skillful means, which essentially is the art of adapting to the person that you're interacting with level of spiritual understanding to talk about it with them. So I love my parents in this way. I love them deeply, but they're not as spiritually aspirational as I am. So when I talk to them about spirituality, I'm not going to jump straight into a huge 2-hour-long monologue about absolute love. That would be a terrible idea. Instead, I talk more about practical things that relate to their teaching or other stuff that they might find more resonant with. And you can apply this to love with anything, right? Love with a kid, love with a partner, love with your friends, upaya. And one of the last things is seeing goodness in someone even when they don't see it. Surprisingly, this has happened with a good amount of people that I'm friends with at Cornell. It's for some reason they don't see how beautiful they are. In turn, like the beautiful values and work ethic and whatnot, and then I shine a light on it, and then they like radiate. So maybe you've experienced the same thing. I don't know. Maybe this is a Cornell specific thing too. Maybe. The last insight. Now we can get to the insight 5 that we were talking about earlier. This is the most powerful aspect of absolute love, and that is absolute love. The insight 5 is loving everything as you. Because any self-other distinction is relative love. It's an imagination on it's a fundamentally false imagination. Because you are everything. You are spirit imagining me, reminding you that you're imagining yourself as not being able to experience absolute love. You want to just be the diamond inside the diamond block, the big diamond ore that we were talking about earlier. You just want to be the stuff that you ascribe to yourself, your emotions and thoughts, your body, the positive aspects of your friends. But one day, hopefully this is the seed, this video will help spark this. You might realize yourself as the entire diamond ore, the blocks of stone, the blocks of diamond ore, and the emergent properties of all of them. All the creative spirit, all the unitive spirit, all the separative spirit, and all the destructive spirit in one celestially radiant, cosmic, perfect spirit. That's quite something. That's it. I hope you loved the video. If you resonated with this, one of the ways you can apply some of the stuff in this video is getting my free college freshman cosmic journaling kit. It's a gamified journaling system that helps you realize absolute love through building your emotional intelligence, your self-understanding, and your purpose in just 15 minutes a day with 1,000 journaling questions and 5 journaling templates. You can get that in the description below. As always, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Eat some peanut butter, and bye-bye.